So today I'm revealing 3 unconventional ways to use social media the right way to grow your podcast. And I'll be sharing with you how to leverage high profile guests in order to grow your podcast even when they don't promote. A simple listener generating funnel that you can start using today in order to reach hundreds of your ideal listeners every single week on autopilot. And finally, how to shortcut your way to a much bigger audience on social media without constantly promoting. This will work for you even if you have no following online. Strategy number 1. This is what I like to call the community value first approach. Now, the typical way that most podcasters try and grow using social media and why it's so flawed is simply this, right? Imagine for a second you have a gardening podcast. I know, bear with me, I promise this will all make sense in just a moment. So look, imagine you have this gardening podcast and you decide to go into the city center. You find a massive square where a bunch of people are just walking by and you decide to start handing out your flyer to a bunch of people walking around. And you're yelling at the top of your lungs, check out my podcast about gardening, check out my podcast about gardening, in hopes to grab a few people's attention who might be interested in your gardening podcast. But the issue is you're battling all the noise, the chaos, the distraction that people have all around them. And after a couple of hours of screaming at the top of your lungs, trying to hand out people flyers, you realize, hang on a minute, this really isn't working. No one's paying attention to you. Everyone's walking by and actually getting kind of irritated by you yelling and screaming. Who would have thought, right? Now, yes, a couple of people might have taken your flyer, but no one actually stopped, pulled out their phone, checked out your gardening podcast, subscribed, and gave it a listen. But why? Why is this happening? The reason why this is happening is because most people who are walking down the square don't care about your gardening podcast, which means you end up promoting to the wrong people as well as promoting in the wrong place, in the totally wrong environment. And that's exactly what happens to so many podcasts when they're promoting online. They're constantly promoting, trying to convince total strangers online to become active listeners of their podcast. Online and on their feed where things are chaotic, people are distracted, there's a bunch of noise going on and there's a low concentration of people who are likely interested in what you have to offer in that exact moment. So you promote all day and night, and no matter how good your content is, people simply walk you by. They scroll by your post and it feels like a screaming into an empty void. And don't worry, I promise this does have a happy ending. Now imagine instead you go to a conference that's all about gardening, and you decide to buy a stall. You set yourself up and you have a massive sign that says top 3 tips to grow your plants even during winter. And because you have your booth, you have this massive sign set up, a bunch of people flock over, they ask you questions, you educate them, you give them insights, you provide a ton of value, and then they simply start asking you, hey, look, dude, how can I learn more about gardening from you? And you share with them, hey, by the way, I've got a podcast all about gardening where I share weekly tips and advice to help you get more out of your gardening. That would be, probably maybe not the best pitch, but you get the point. So what happens then? Well, a bunch of people who are the right listeners, the right people who are interested in what you have to offer, they pull out their phone, they find your podcast, they hit subscribe, and in that moment, you've gained a bunch of new listeners. And this right here is a new way of growing your podcast online. It's not about screaming into an empty void, trying to convince a bunch of people who simply, quite frankly, don't care about your podcast. As hard as that pill might be to swallow. So what should you do instead? So whilst the old approach is screaming at the top of your lungs, hoping to God someone clicks play and listens to your show, the new approach says, you know what? We're going to find online communities where there's a high concentration of my audience. I'm going to post valuable content within that community to qualify the people who actually care about what I have to share. And only then do I then reach out to the individuals who've shown interest and offer them a specific podcast episode based on the piece of content they engaged with. That is the community value first approach. And you might be wondering, that sounds great, but what are the specifics? How the hell can you start implementing that today? So here are the exact steps you can start taking today in order to use the community value first strategy to grow your podcast and to reach way more listeners. So strategy 1, the community value first approach. All you have to do is identify 3 to 5 Facebook groups where your ideal listeners already hangs out. You don't want to go overboard and go crazy and tag the 10 groups. It'll be very hard to actually keep a hold of. So start with 3 to 5. Now, it's going to be important when you're qualifying these groups that you have a look at the engagement, because there are a lot of dead communities online. So for yourself and for your sake, so you don't waste a bunch of time, you want to look at groups that have at least 10 to 20 new members joining per week, where they're posting at least 3 to 4 times per day. That is an indication of life. There's life. The group is alive. The worst thing that you could do is essentially just join a group that looks great and is massive, like 50,000 plus. However, it's not actually growing and people aren't engaging. That's a waste of time. So again, 3 to 5 high quality groups where people are joining on a consistent basis and they're constantly, posting new content within those communities. The second piece is spend 2 weeks providing value, being genuinely helpful, and provide insightful comments. I know you actually have to, provide value and be genuine, and you're not just going to get listeners overnight. But this is really important, right? Because let's say you're going to build a relationship with these people. You want to be genuine. You want to actually be helpful. I know that sounds kind of crazy in this day and age that we're living in, but yeah, you got to be helpful. Who would have thought, right? This means just posting valuable content, whether that's tips, whether that's posing, curiosity-driven questions. The point is just start engaging, start becoming known in this community, start building your own personal brand. You kind of want to be an MVP. You want to be that person who is there to provide value, who's not just there to take, but who's there to give. What will happen over time is people will start recognizing your name, which is super important. And they'll start engaging with you because you're constantly engaging with them. After that 2-week period, now it's time to jump, right? After building your visibility, you want to start intentionally reaching out directly to individuals who've engaged with your content. So when someone likes a piece of content you posted in the community, if someone engages with a comment you left on their post, just reach out to them and say, hey, thank you so much for, for that like, for that comment. Just to let you know, I have a podcast talking about gardening, sharing tips every single week. I'd love to know if you're open to me sharing an episode with you. I think you'd really love it based on our past interaction in the community. Again, super light, super gentle. You're not being pushy, and you're definitely not trying to be that guy who's annoying. You don't want to just be a pitch fest. Again, you want to come off as someone who genuinely cares and wants to provide value first. And what you'll see is so many people will say, yes, hell yes, send me over a link. And at that point, you send them a link to your podcast episode. You can follow up maybe a day later and ask, how did they find it? And it'll give you feedback. And there you have a listener right there. And if you're thinking this sounds super long, sounds kind of drawn out, like you have to really message every single person. Yeah, this can really take 15 minutes per day, 50 to 20 minutes per day in order for you to start seeing significant growth of your podcast. And if you don't have that time or you want to invest more time, you can just outsource this to a VA or a team member who can just consistently find these groups, post these valuable content, and do the outreach for you. My recommendation, though, will be start by doing it yourself, because simply put, you'll see it working and you'll have way more conviction to know it's something that you should prioritize as a growth strategy and something you can give to a team member fully confident this actually works. Because God knows, and we know, that there's so many strategies out there that simply sound great but don't work. And I know that this one works, but you've got to try it for yourself and get that positive feedback and have that conviction for yourself. Now, here's an example of a client who used a strategy and added 50 subscribers within a couple of days. And here are responses of people who have replied to my messages of my team members and my, assistants who've been reaching out, sending these valuable specific episodes. You can see that this absolutely does work. So you should take the action. So look, why does the strategy work so well? Well, it's simple, right? You're building genuine relationships rather than ones that's just driven by promotion. You're demonstrating that you are in fact an expert before just essentially just inviting people to commit to like an hour-long show. And of course, you create those one-on-one connections that people kind of need. It's not just about the algorithms and pushing things on content and trying to play the game. You're building genuine relationships with people who are going to be highly targeted and would make for perfect listeners for your podcast. So now moving on to strategy number 2, which is what I like to call the community sponsorship method, which essentially is a fancy way of saying you sponsoring other online communities where you have thousands of highly targeted members who are engaging with a particular topic. So similarly, when it came to the gardening podcast, right? They found a conference where there's a bunch of people who would actually care and give a crap about their podcast. Now, when it comes to the community value first strategy, of course, we're setting up our stall, we're providing some value, and we're attracting and qualifying the right people who we believe will be the right fit for our podcast. The difference here is instead of setting up your own stall, you essentially reach out to the owner of the conference and you say, hey, I would love to sponsor this entire thing. And I would love to have a billboard right at the entrance when people are joining. And every single person who actually enters the conference, I want you to give them a leaflet that recommends my top podcast episode, that shares exactly how they can get way more from their gardening using my podcast as a resource for value. Now, as you can see, this is really taking things to the next level. Instead of you kind of like setting up your stall, hoping people come to you, you're no longer chasing people anymore. They're essentially being sent to you, which makes a massive difference, as you can imagine. And the best part about this is the trust is super high, your visibility is even higher, and the ongoing consistent traffic to your podcast is huge. That is the power of sponsoring a highly targeted community. Now, what the hell does this mean and how the hell does this relate to podcasts? How do you do this in the online space? And that is exactly what I'm going to break down for you. So strategy 2, the community sponsorship method. Super simple. You want to identify groups and communities on Facebook that have 5,000 plus members, right? And have 20 new people joining per day. Again, these are bigger groups. And you want to craft a personalized outreach message offering value to the community members. And then you also want to spot and pinpoint who are the admin members, who owns this group, reach out to them and then start negotiating. Hey, look, guys, I'm interested in sponsoring your community. I love what you're doing. Is this something you're open to? I can share some terms with you. And within that, if they say yes, you want to suggest that every week when new members join, they just create a simple welcome post. And all you ask is for them to recommend your podcast as a valuable resource for them to learn more about whatever topic your show is about. And they can just add that link in the first comment section below. Now, for them, this is a huge value add because so many people have massive online Facebook group communities, but they're not really doing much with it. They just kind of created it for fun. It's kind of taken a life of its own. God knows we would love to have their community, but for whatever reason, the ball landed on their court. And now they've got this beast of a community that they don't really know what to do with. So for them, as a value add, seen as a partner with a podcaster, it adds more credibility to their group. And it also means that they kind of have like this additional resource that they can send to their audience. So this is a very clear value proposition. Now, within that as well, you can ask them to pin posts of specific podcast episodes. Now, if the podcast episode title is crappy and not attractive, no one's going to click play and listen. So make sure it is super attractive, talking about a pain point, something that's going to capture the most amount of people and get them to click play and listen to the podcast. And finally, for you, just engage, share insights, share valuable stuff. And then, of course, let the admin know that once in a while you might promote a podcast episode. And for that, just find a price that makes sense for you. For me, if the community's got 5,000 members, 20 listeners joining per day, for me personally, my budget would be like from $100 to maybe $300 per month. Again, just depends on your budget and depends what the actual community members are looking for. Some might even do it for free. But the whole point is, again, you leverage their audience and you compensate them for them sharing your podcast to their audience. Now, again, what I love about this is every single week, you're going to be exposed to more of the right listeners who are joining in. Facebook is doing the hard work and the community is naturally growing, is naturally finding the right listeners. And you're simply, again, being put and being exposed to the right highly targeted listeners. What do you think that could do for your podcast? So look, the third and final strategy is this. It's called the super fan activation technique. It sounds super fancy, a bit dramatic, just slightly dramatic, but here's what it really means. It simply means understanding how to leverage high profile guests onto your podcast in a way to drive way more growth for your show. Now, a growth strategy that so many podcasts try to use is leveraging high profile guests onto their show. And the idea is, let's say, for example, you invite someone on Instagram who, again, is massive in the gardening space. They have 500,000 followers. And the hopes is you invite this guest on. They are a high profile guest in your industry. They've got a massive following. The hope is that when they come onto your show, provide value, afterwards, they're going to go out there and promote the podcast, share it to their audience, and their audience will actually then be exposed to your podcast and become a listener of your show, become a fan of the podcast. That's what we hope anyway. But what typically happens, and I'm sure you might have experienced this as well, is that you do get the guest on, you have an incredible show, but then the guest doesn't go out there and, scream at the top of their lungs, check out this podcast that I was a guest on. They don't promote their podcast on social media. They don't share the viral clips. They don't even send it to their newsletter. They essentially just show up, provide their value, and then they dip. And you're the one who's left to do all the groundwork when it comes to marketing the podcast and actually gaining traction from their big name. And even when at times the high profile guest does promote, what you often find, which is again super frustrating, is that they share it with their audience, but only a fraction of their audience actually checks out the podcast. And the question is, well, why does this happen? Why aren't guests sharing the podcast more and more? Well, the simple truth is, if you have a high profile guest on your podcast, they've got 1,000 things going on. They've got a bunch of different things that they might be promoting at the time. They might have certain promotional campaigns where their social media post has to be very targeted for a very specific reason. So that could be one reason. Another reason, which is more likely, is that they're just busy. They're distracted. And they've got so many things going on, they don't really think about it. It's kind of like, if you hosted, let's say, a mad party, you invite a bunch of your friends in hopes that your friends will invite plus ones and a bunch of other people. Whereas your friend is just thinking, hey, look, I'm just going to come to this party. I'm going to rock up and I'm going to celebrate. There's going to be a bunch of people here. It's going to be good fun. I can't wait. Your friend, they're just coming to your party to celebrate. And similarly, your guest, they're coming to your podcast to be interviewed. So they're coming to just provide their value, share their insights in hopes that actually you do a lot of the groundwork in getting them exposure, and not only you allowing them to access your audience, but in terms of you doing the job of the host and promoting the podcast to the best of your ability in order to get the actual episode the most amount of exposure. Now, would it be helpful if they promoted the podcast? Absolutely. Now, should they promote the podcast? Hell fucking yes. Hell yes, they should. But will they? Most likely not. So then again, the question becomes, well, how can you, regardless of if a guest does promote or doesn't promote, how can you give yourself more power to leverage their big name regardless, to grow your podcast, expand your reach, even when they don't actively promote your podcast? Here's exactly how to do that. When you're booking a high profile guest onto your podcast, let's say, for example, you're going to have Tim Ferriss on your show. Tim Ferriss, huge in the space, huge in the personal development sphere. So find specific fan pages or communities where you believe Tim Ferriss's fan would be. Now, you want to essentially promote the competition, meaning you want to go onto the Facebook group and make a post announcing, hey, look, I've got Tim Ferriss on my podcast. What I want to do is I want to give everyone an opportunity to ask Tim a question. I'm going to make a thread on this post, and the top 3 questions that have the highest level of engagement and likes on them are the questions I'm going to ask Tim within a segment of my podcast. Now, what this will do is it will really help boost the engagement on that post, because how Facebook works is the more people engage with a piece of content within these communities, the more that piece of content is shared to more of the people in that community. Now, what we've done is we've gamified this process to ensure that we're winning, right? To make sure that essentially we've got the algorithm's favor on our side by getting people to like, engage, comment, like the questions that they want to see you ask to Tim Ferriss that being, right? And you want to also make sure that you tag both the admin and the winners when the episode launched. So after you've launched the episode, you then want to go back into those communities and simply just make a post saying, hey, by the way, guys, I interviewed him. It went awesome. And thank you to everyone who contributed. Think the admin, just suck up a little bit, I guess. To make sure that they're on your side. And then, of course, tag every single person who engaged with your previous post, and then announce the winner and let them know what minute you ask the questions. What this will do is it will build a massive buzz around your show. You've got a bunch of people who are super fans of your guest. You leverage the guest's big name to attract all of those people to your show. And then, of course, you're promoting your podcast to a very high concentration of people who are actually interested. They've liked, they've commented, they've shown great levels of interest. And finally, you want to make sure you leave 0 stones unturned. We're going crazy here, right? So you need to reach out to every single person who has left you a like, a comment, or engage in any kind of way with your competition post. And you want to send them the specific episode, letting them know, hey, the episode's out. And then finally thanking them and asking them, hey, look, do you have feedback? What do you think of the episode? Do you like it? This is such a better way to promote high-profile guests onto your podcast, to leverage their name, to grow your audience without you constantly relying and hoping and praying that they actually promote, which they just never bloody do. And even when they do, it's not always the most effective thing. Now you have the control. How do you think this will change things for you? And look, here are some results of one of our clients who did this exact strategy and added a ton of people engaging with this post. People who would have never discovered this podcast, but people who became active as the listeners of his show because he utilized this strategy. So again, use a strategy the next time you land a high-profile guest onto your podcast to grow way faster. So look, to recap, while most podcasters are out there promoting constantly all day and all night on social media, trying to convince total strangers online who don't care about their podcast to become active raving fans of their show, all that leads to kind of more time, more energy, thousands of dollars spent on promotional clips that doesn't get them anywhere. Now, you now know 3 specific unconventional ways to grow your podcast using social media that isn't the traditional method of growing, which is number 1, the community value first approach, where you find online hotspots where your audience are. This can be Facebook groups, Reddit threads, Twitter spaces, doesn't really matter. And you post highly targeted and valuable content. You then reach out to members who've engaged with your content and share specific podcast episode based on the piece of content they've engaged with. This way, you're targeting the right community that has a high concentration of potential listeners, and then you're reaching out and suggesting very specific and targeted podcast episode you know has the highest chance of converting because it has high relevancy. Strategy number 2, the community sponsorship strategy, where you find, again, a targeted community, but this time you reach out to the admin members and you let them know exactly what you like to offer them. You let them know you want to collaborate. And by doing so, every week, you're being recommended to way more of the right listeners who are constantly being exposed to your podcast. And then finally, the superfan activation technique, where you find online targeted community where there are a ton of people who are a fan of the guests you're having onto your podcast. Once again, you create a gamified system where the top question within the post you make in a group gets asked to your guest. You gamify the system, you get a bunch of people interested in your podcast. You kind of sleight of hand promote the podcast without actively being that annoying guy that's always promoting the podcast. And it's a great way to get the community involved, leverage a big name, and drive way more exposure to your podcast. So look, with that being said, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.